For the first 3+ weeks of Baptist Briefs, we've focused on the historical origins of Baptists. In telling that history, of course, we've looked at the principles and doctrines that came to define the Baptist movement. But is there one principle that stands apart, that lies at the core of Baptist belief, one from which all others are derived? E.Y. Mullins thought so. A little over a century ago, Mullins, president of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, wrote a book entitled The Axioms of Religion, in which he set forth 6 axioms that he said work together to define the Baptist faith. Early in the book, Mullins asked, what then is the distinguishing Baptist principle? After considering each of what we today call Baptist distinctives, he concluded, the sufficient statement of the historical significance of the Baptists is this: the competency of the soul in religion. A competency under God, not a competency in the sense of human self-sufficiency. Over a half-century later, in 1963, Southern Baptists revised their confessional statement, the Baptist Faith and Message. The late Herschel Hobbs, longtime pastor of First Baptist Church, Oklahoma City, and chair of the committee that wrote the revised Baptist Faith and Message, wrote a study guide to it in which he quoted Mullins and reaffirmed Mullins' conviction that soul competency, in Hobbes' words, is the distinctive Baptist belief. In 2000, Grady Cawthon and James Dunn co-authored a book entitled Soul Freedom, to which we'll return during the next few days. Cawthon and Dunn consider this conviction of soul competency, soul freedom, so critical that they subtitled their book, Baptist Battle Cry. Yesterday we saw that Baptist leaders spanning several generations, from the dawn of the 20th century to the present, have called soul competency the distinctive Baptist principle from which all others are derived. But distinctive from what? Distinctive from whom? In Chapter 4 of the Axioms of Religion, entitled The Soul's Competency in Religion, E.Y. Mullins explored what other denominations say about the competency of the soul in religious matters. Catholicism, he wrote, asserts at every point the soul's incompetency in religion. It regards the soul as incompetent to deal alone with God. The laity are dependent on the priesthood. Every order in the hierarchy depends on the next higher order, Mullins wrote, to receive instruction for the intellect and the rule for moral and religious life. As for Protestant churches, Mullins wrote, all the churches which adhere to infant baptism come short of the New Testament principle. Even though they tend to give lip service to justification by faith, they deny the child the privilege of taking responsibility for his or her own salvation. Thus, the soul is seen as incompetent. Mullins added that the New Testament principle of the soul's competency is violated also in all forms of church polity which retain episcopacy and any form of ecclesiastical oligarchy. Note the relationship there between local church autonomy and soul competency. As we noted earlier, all Baptist principles can be traced back to soul competency. Yesterday we saw how our stand for soul competency or soul freedom sharply distinguishes Baptists from other Christians. But what does soul freedom have to do with our mission of sharing Christ with the world? In Chapter 3 of Soul Freedom, James Dunn writes that all authentic missions and evangelism are predicated upon a voluntary response. We call that soul freedom. He then tells of a Christmas pageant in 1998 at a public elementary school in Clay County, West Virginia. When it ended, the principal stood up and said to the students, "If you don't know Jesus Christ as your personal Savior, come forth now and be saved." Dunn remarks that responsible evangelism and mature missions are marked by respect for the freedom of each individual soul. In other words, manipulating a captive audience of school children into a snap religious decision is disrespectful to them and disobedient to God. And we see yet another Baptist principle, in this case religious liberty. tracing its way back to soul competency. Dunn decries what he calls militant manipulative outreach programs. There's no such thing as real evangelism, he writes, without real religious freedom. When Jesus dealt with the rich young ruler in Matthew 19, he told the inquirer in plain language what it would take to be one of his followers. Jesus did not trip him, zap him, or call him back. He refused to run roughshod over anyone or to violate conscience. Dunn concludes this chapter by quoting Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the martyred German theologian. Bonhoeffer wrote that obedience without freedom is slavery, and liberty enables people to do good. On Friday, James Dunn told us in Chapter 3 of Soul Freedom, a book he co-authored with Grady Cawthon, that authentic missions and evangelism require respect for the freedom of each individual soul. In Chapter 9, Dunn insists that there is no freedom for the soul with a creed. He distinguishes creed from confession. A creed prescribes, he writes, while a confession of faith describes one's approach to religion. It's love, not law, faith, not facts, persons, not propositions, experience with God, not expectations of persons, at the heart of free and faithful Baptists. Dunn quotes a favorite saying that puts the Baptist conviction in a nutshell. Ain't nobody but Jesus going to tell me what to believe. But Christians, he points out, have had to deal with creedalism from the beginning. The Apostle Paul, after all, confronted creedalism among the early Christians in Galatia. In Galatians 3, he reminded them that no one is justified before God by the law. And in chapter 5, he declared that it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Dunn says that legalists find it hard to live without a rule-book religion. Then and now, rationalism reduces religion to rules. He insists that authentic faith is living and dynamic and embraces the mystery of God. One's bucket of religion and spirituality, he writes, is very small if it holds only what one knows. There's a ton of spiritual stuff that none of us can get our puny minds around. But Dunn admits that a creedless Christianity based on soul freedom is risky. In tomorrow's Baptist Brief, we'll look at what James Dunn calls safeguards against subjectivism. 4 substantial flying buttresses propping up the churches, keeping our freedom faithful.